What if I told you that not only will social media negatively impact your mental health, but also your physical health, your performance in the gym, on the court, and on the field? As always, I've got studies for you. Let's get straight into it. Here we go. Now, I don't want to go too deeply into the psychological research because I want to keep this to physical performance, sports, lifting, but I do want to call out one study done in Saudi Arabia that looked at the particular features of social media and the negative or positive impacts that they had. The feature that had the greatest impact on mental health were likes, comments, and followers, suggesting that seeking validation through social media is probably not very good for you. And those seeking validation and self-esteem through likes, comments, and followers are probably more prone to developing anxiety and also depression. Most interesting part of this study, though, to me, was that browsing posts and media sharing were almost as, injurious to one's mental health as likes, comments, and followers, which I think most people would guess or surmise that seeking validation through social media is a bad thing. However, many people who think that way will still just share posts or just browse, doom scroll through social media. And again, that seems to be almost nearly as negatively impactful as seeking validation itself. And this leads me to the research on physical performance. You are here on a website, YouTube channel called MuscleWiki. So we're gonna start with the muscle part, lifting weights, and we've got two studies to look at here. Our first study, effects of social media on smartphone use before and during velocity-based resistance exercise. The researchers had the participants use social media or watch television for 30 minutes prior to engaging in resistance training. They were measuring velocity as their method of measuring fatigue. So they looked for what would be a 20% drop off in velocity and would consider that as the person has now reached fatigue. We cut the set off here. Now, the researchers did not find any difference between the two groups, the group that used social media and the group that watched television. But I want to point out something particular about this study, or highlight something in particular, which is, again, the way they measured fatigue, which was velocity loss. I don't think measuring a 20% decrease in velocity is the best way of measuring fatigue. You will typically see 20% loss in the speed of a rep definitely by halfway through the set, if not maybe a little bit earlier. So we haven't gone into the deep waters of fatigue quite yet. We haven't fatigued enough for us to be able to see significant differences. That's my key, I guess, criticism with this study. And that brings me to our second study. Mental fatigue from smartphone use reduces volume load resistance training. And these researchers came to a different conclusion. By the way, these two studies had many of the same researchers. The structure was very similar. They had one group watch a documentary for 30 minutes, and they had the other group use social media for 30 minutes prior to lifting. The difference here is the groups lifted to failure. And surprise, surprise, there was a significant difference between the group that watched the documentary and the group that used social media. The social media group were able to do significantly less reps than the documentary group, or less volume. As we all know, volume is one of the key drivers of muscle growth, so this is a pretty big deal for our gains. Of course, physicality cannot be a reasonable explanation for why this is happening. Using social media is not physically strenuous. You're just sitting there, you're using your thumbs at most to engage with it. So the only reasonable explanation here is that there is something psychological happening. We do know from other studies that social media is incredibly cognitively demanding. The sheer amount of stimulus you're being bombarded with when you use Facebook or X or Instagram is massive. It's an amount of stimulus that our brains are not meant to handle. We're not meant to know what's going on across the world. We're not really meant to be interacting with millions of people. Humans evolved in very small tribes and groups of people. And the negative effects that social media has on the mental health of the individual demonstrate that. Now, lifting weights is also a very cognitively demanding task. First, you have to force yourself to do something that you don't really want to do, and then you have to continue for 30, 45, 60, 90 minutes to do something that is not really enjoyable. You may have heard personal trainers or social media influencers talk about how you need to make going to the gym fun. I vehemently disagree. Working out is hard, it's meant to be hard, and that's why it's so rewarding. We humans evolved to handle difficult tasks well, and we get very positive responses from our minds and bodies when we engage with difficult tasks. But doing the difficult task it's still a difficult task. Still not convinced? I've got more studies. Let's talk about swimming. One study looked at swimmers performing the 50, 100, and 200 meter race, and they found that social media use had a negative impact on the 100 and the 200 meter races, but not the 50. So this returns me to my earlier point about you don't really see any negative impact until you get dragged into the deep waters, pun intended, of fatigue. With shorter races and shorter activities, you don't really see this negative impact. But once we start engaging in longer amounts of physical activity, we do. Now, why this may be the case, I can only speculate. My level of expertise is in fitness, not in psychology. However, I can tell you that, as I've said before, willpower, I think, gets a little more, it gets applied in places where it doesn't exactly belong. But I'm just gonna leave it at that. A similar paper also examined the 50, 100, and 400 meter races, and they found the same thing. The 50 meter race had no impact after having used social media, but the 100 and 400 meter races did. Another study looked at boxing performance, and they looked at attack and defense decision making, and also counter movement. They had one group play video games, one group use social media, and then a control group. And they found that the video game group and the social media group had negative effects on their decision making and performance. Of course, video games are also very cognitively demanding. You're being bombarded with a lot of stimulus, a lot of decision making, especially depending on the game. And so that cognitive demand leads to cognitive fatigue, and that cognitive fatigue means that you will fatigue more quickly in your body as well, or at least you'll think or feel like you're fatiguing more quickly. The same research group also took a look at volleyball. One interesting thing about this study is they did a 4-week training block for all of the subjects, and they would have one group watch Olympic videos of volleyball, and the other group would use social media. The researchers examined jump performance and decision making and endurance. Now, they found no difference in the jump performance and no difference in the endurance. However, they found a massive difference in decision-making abilities, being the social media group, their decision-making skills suffered after having using social media when compared to watching those videos. Across multiple sports and activities, there was a measurable decrease in performance after having used social media, pointing to the idea that social media is so cognitively demanding, it begins to affect your mental health and therefore your physical health. Your mind and your body are inextricably linked. We can't view either thing in a vacuum as though they're disconnected. They're very much so connected, and they affect one another. So if social media is negatively impacting your mental health, that will therefore impact your physical health and lead to less gains. And we don't want that. That's it for today, folks. I'm Coach Ty with Muscle Wiki. Please check out 2 more videos. They'll be here in the corners for you in a second. Like, comment, subscribe, and share. I will see you with the next one. Deuces.